You're listening to episode 297 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Jeff Eisenberg returns to the podcast to speak about his book, Buddha's Bodyguard: How to Protect Your Inner V.I.P. Hi everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the sporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any of the other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us on the conversation. Though there are differing opinions, the Dhamma, like other teachings, has some wiggle room in how it may be interpreted. Some may be very minor nuances of view. Others may be wildly off base, as secular Buddhism is sometimes seen. That interpretive openness shows the Dhamma fits into a myriad of life circumstances, and that the ingredients of the moment can be taken in ways that result in unique manifestations appropriate to the individual. Today's guest shares how Buddhist thought and practice resonates quite deeply for him when reflecting on shielding from harm, internally and externally. Jeff Eisenberg is a Grandmaster-level martial arts and meditation teacher with over 40 years of training and 25 years of teaching experience. He has run his own dojo for nearly 15 years and trained thousands of children and adults in the martial arts. He's also worked as a bodyguard, investigator, and director of crisis response in the emergency and psychiatric ward of a major hospital. Also author of the best-selling book, Fighting Buddha, he lives in Long Beach, New Jersey. So sit back, relax, and have a nice almond afternoon tea. I guess today returning to the podcast is our friend Jeff Eisenberg. Jeff, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Thank you much, Ted. Appreciate it.
So glad you're here. So you got a new book. And this is, I presume, a follow-up to your second one, maybe a little bit different, Buddha's Bodyguard. Tell us about this one. What made you decide to go into the trenches and write another book? Because that's not an easy undertaking.
No, well, you know what? The first one took 30 years. The second one took a year. So the first one kind of taught me what I needed to know. But you're right. It's definitely a commitment, and when I'm writing, it's like I can't not write. So, one of my teachers, Noah Levine, someone asked him, "What are you working on?" He said, "Thank God, nothing." What's interesting about Buddha's Bodyguard is it really the idea of it was resonating with me for many, many years. And I never really put it down on paper or even drew up an outline or anything for many years, but coming from the bodyguard world and the security world, and my perspective of Buddhism as something to do, tasks to be done, and actions to be taken, I always saw the practices as a way of protecting oneself. And to me, it read like a strategic plan to implement right from day one. And it was just always kind of resonating with me. And coming from Fighting Buddha, which was kind of memoirish about my journey in learning Buddhism, I kind of wanted to share what I came up with in terms of how to do it or how I do it. It's certainly not telling people how to do it. It's kind of what I came up with for myself and wanted to share that. So, it just was a natural kind of segue into taking the Buddhist teachings I learned and sharing how I implement them, which is in my perspective, protecting myself, my well-being, my Buddha nature. I love my subtitle, which is How to Protect Your Inner V.I.P.
Yeah, I noticed that the way in which you approach the subject is in keeping with your background and who you are, this area of protection, but the way you're looking at it is with protecting one's heart, protecting one's mind, protecting one's self, knowing that that's kind of a loaded word in Buddhist circles, but that this is in the same way one might find the phrase guarding the sense doors. You're extending that into more fully the Eightfold Path and the rest of it. So say a little bit more about that, about how you approach the Dhamma from this view of protection, of guarding, of care.
Well, I think the first aspect kind of plays into I hate using this word, but the secular aspect of things.
We welcome that word here. It's okay.
I know you do. And I don't hate using it, but I think everyone understands why I would say I hate using it. Because, I never looked at the Buddha as, and I'm basically paraphrasing the book here because you've actually brought up quite a few things that I target in the book already. But I never looked at the Buddha as something, as a not only not a deity, but let alone some kind of force that comes from without us to swoop in and save us. It wasn't, the Buddha and the Buddhist teachings were not something outside that I saw outside me that I looked to do anything for me. So for me, it was always about shouldering the responsibility, doing the footwork, and that, the Buddha or the Buddhist teachings or whatever people like to reference to themselves is within us, and we have to bring it out and cultivate it and manifest it. And so that was the first aspect of protecting myself was my job. And it involved specific things I had to do.
And how wonderful, because you have a sense of agency and ownership over this. You get to decide to do that.
That got easier as I got more able to be clear about my own intentions, but yes. But so where I start in the book is when we bodyguard or protect somebody, the first thing we do is what's called a security survey, where we interview the client and we do a full assessment of every aspect of their life, from their work relationships, their personal relationships, their medical status, their possible indiscretions or dalliances, and we try to understand what makes them vulnerable. And so the book starts with doing a security assessment or survey of ourselves, identifying our own vulnerabilities and knowing what triggers us, what's a threat to our well-being, to our peace of mind, to our ability to be present or aware. And then it segues from that into what's called hardening the target, which is in the bodyguard world, where you, after identifying those vulnerabilities, you come up with a strategic plan of how to secure them. The hope is to eliminate them, and then the lesser is, if they can't be eliminated, to lessen the possibility of a successful threat against them. So in terms of Buddhist practice, for me, this was identifying unhealthy people in my life, unhealthy situations and circumstances, changing them or eliminating them. But I think more it's about turning the focus inward and looking at the conditioning and seeing, what about my conditioning is what points of it are the vulnerabilities that get triggered. So that's kind of the first aspect of it.
And it sounds like that first aspect, that assessment, clear seeing, being very necessary for that, and the hardening. I can perhaps hear people feeling of that as sounding a bit harsh and a bit separating. And what I would suggest in this, because knowing you and hearing this, is not so much about I'm going to build walls around myself. It's not what's meant. It is making decisions for your own well-being based on seeing things as they are. And it may not be easy.
Absolutely. I mean, and the interesting thing about hardening the target, and I get the language and how that could be misconstrued. The interesting thing about at least vulnerabilities in the sense of our well-being is that the real way to harden them is to engage them and completely feel the vulnerability and understand it and know it and make ourselves, because it's not an aversionary tactic,
right?
Where you're right, we seal it up and wall it off, and that's the protection. It's about being vulnerable and not having the same habitual reactivity while being vulnerable.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's the language is a little, I guess, can be interpreted a little contradictory, but it's really about almost keeping your enemy closer, so to speak.
So there's your first part. How about your second part? What's next?
You know what? I have this problem of I go back in my books and I read them and I say, wow, this is pretty good. I totally forgot I wrote that. So I might not get this in perfect chronological order. So I talk about the Buddhist path. Well, there's a couple aspects. In the bodyguard world, it's not seen as a mission failure to need to evacuate, to need to take refuge. And that's where I equate it. With the middle way, I equate the middle way as an alternate route where, and again, language is going to trip me up here, but I understand and present the middle way as a way of being fully engaged with our lives. But that's it's counterintuitive to what we normally would do if we're acting out our conditioning. So I look at the middle way as our alternate evacuation route from just kind of going down that same old path we always do. So in the bodyguard world, in the sense of having to evacuate because a threat has been launched, and taking cover along you would have your evacuation routes already mapped out, and you know safe houses along the way, whether it's emergency rooms, medical clinics, fire stations, police stations. So it's not only taking the route, but it's knowing what's along the route to evacuate to.
Right.
So I've equated that with the middle way and with taking refuge, where taking refuge is not a way of avoiding the difficulty, but it's a way of actually committing to facing the difficulty, just like evacuating and changing your strategic plan in the midst of it, or not doing what would be seen as normal. Hate that word. But in the context of Buddhism, everything we do goes against what seemingly is the normal thing for us to do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about following your instincts, about being intuitive, about, hopefully meditation is giving us some wisdom, and we're getting in touch with like that intrinsic knowledge. And that's what a bodyguard has to do. A bodyguard can't think because it's going to be too late. A bodyguard has to not add anything to the situation, but rather respond appropriately and skillfully. So, showing up at, let's say, an emergency room with a bleeding, hurt client is actually considered a success. So for me, ending up on the cushion, or ending up at a Zendo, or ending up in a conversation of support with another like-minded person is not a sign of weakness; it's a sign of strength. And it's also about taking the ego out of it. As a bodyguard, you can't let your ego draw you into an altercation that wasn't going to happen. You could be in a tense situation and make it worse by, taking things personally. And it's in my Buddhist practice, it's obviously we have our personal experience that is personal, but to own it as personal in the sense of adding the judgment to ourselves and adding the shame or blame or things like that.
Yeah. So as you were writing this book in a relatively short time frame compared to the first book, what were some of the things that came up for you as aha moments, things that maybe were different perspectives or different ways of looking at things, or you saw them a little more deeply than you had before? Was there any of that stuff that came up for you?
In terms of my own practice or how I viewed myself?
Yeah, just in your own practice, in whatever way it may have shown up for you.
I think because this idea and this way of looking at things and this perspective that was kind of always with me, nothing. I didn't really have any epiphanies or any aha moments about myself. I think if anything, as I wrote it, the aha moments were like being able to articulate something I knew that maybe could be helpful to other people, because I did, as I'm writing it, and while I was never in law enforcement, I spent a lot of years training law enforcement in restraint and arrest tactics, though with a Buddhist perspective of, and that's another thing that comes up in the book, and I'm sorry I'm kind of diverting from the topic, but here's an aha moment. The professionalism and protocol of a bodyguard is exactly the same as being a Buddhist. And I really didn't kind of hit on that. Like, I was always aware of the tactics as skillful actions, but I wasn't so in tune with being Buddhist and being a bodyguard being so similar. And this might seem strange to people, but I ran emergency and psychiatric security for a long time, and even in the bodyguard world, like I mentioned a few moments ago, you can't take things personally. You can't you can't be attached to that self and respond from an egoic place. You can't add what you think about the person or the situation. You have to assess it and be appropriate and skillful for what's right in front of you in the moment. And this also involves treating people with respect and dignity, and understanding and compassion, and so the whole notion of how you treat someone, for lack of better words, when you're having to put your hands on them and escort them out or restrain them if it was in the hospital, is the model of being Buddhist. And I know there's people out there that say, well, you're doing something, quote, violent. How can it be Buddhist? But with the intention of caring about someone and not wanting them to hurt themselves or hurt someone else, my definition of violence is an intended harmful act that comes from ignorance, where the use of force coming from a clear, seeing intention to help is what stops violence.
Right. It's violent to pull a child out from stepping into traffic too, and yet we would not do that.
Absolutely. So there's been many, and it's from our last conversation, I know you kind of understand where my martial arts is not the typical martial arts involved that's usually involved with Buddhism. I do jujitsu, I fight, I do all these kind of hardcore reality-based things that I consider meditative practice.
Yep.
And the restraining of a non-compliant person or a person acting out is just as meditative for me, because you have to be present and aware. You have to be clear seeing. You have to be focused. And with that, the demeanor is, rather than an escalation of your demeanor or agitation, it's actually a deep calm that comes from, if I have to restrain somebody in that situation, I'm deep breathing. I'm actually meditating, eyes open, while I'm doing it. And at the same time, the language is very important. Please, sir, can you come with me? Thank you. I appreciate you helping me out. Explaining what's happening to the person, because a lot of times there's a mental illness there that they don't understand, or the fact that they're non-compliant is simply because they're afraid.
Right.
So taking that one step further, it's the perfect way to handle every person I interact with in my life. To say, to not take what, and I'm not saying anything new. I realize this is Buddhism 101, but, to realize that we're all connected, we're interconnected, that I don't know what a person's dealing with, and to come engage them with understanding, compassion, and a willingness to help, regardless of what they're saying or doing, because I'm doing this, in a professional setting where I might be being spit at, people they're trying to bite me, do all sorts of horrendous things. And, to be okay with that and a smile on your face is no different than interacting with the person that, flips you off when they cut you off.
Right. So, Jeff, what are some things that you're hoping that people who read the book are going to get out of it? What are some of the highlights for you of, this is really what I want them to understand?
Well, I think that, like myself, like possibly people that follow secular Buddhism, I think we were drawn to Buddhism because of a philosophy that resonated, but then got there and didn't feel like there was a way, not that there wasn't a way, but there was no one really saying this is how you do it. Possibly because the teacher's perspective wasn't like that, or in my experience, sometimes possibly they really didn't know. They, they were teaching, teaching teachings, ingrading, a dogma, which is fine, but what I wanted was, like, I was coming from a place of, I want to transform. I want to be liberated. I want to change. And I get the part about sitting down and experiencing myself. And I never want people to misunderstand me. I think, what happens on the cushion is vital. It's the foundation for everything. My perspective that's evolved is, I just think there's not enough. What do you do when you get up off that cushion, and how do you take what happened on the cushion and make it work for you?
Yeah.
And that's kind of been my journey, because that was my journey in martial arts before I really pursued Buddhism, which was, okay, I understand what's happening on the mat here, but I want it to work for me. I don't want to just look good on the mat and you put lots of stripes on my belt and, I can present it and demonstrate it well. I need this to be applicable. So I'm hoping that what I've achieved here is making it more accessible to take the teachings and make them applicable, and so people can turn them into skillful action and really, I kind of disagree with that. Buddhism isn't self-help. I know a lot of people don't like attaching those things.
Yeah.
But I every day I set my aspirations. It's about helping myself, and through helping myself, I don't feel I'm any good to you if I'm not good to me.
Right.
So it is about helping myself. It is about changing and transforming and putting that work in every second of every day. I mean, and sometimes that work is just realizing how we just really effed up.
Mm-hmm.
But it, to me, it's a difficult practice, because not that it's difficult to do, it's difficult to maintain our commitment to it to the degree that we need to.
Right. Yeah. It's one thing to commit to, I'm going to meditate for X amount of time every day. And that's a good thing. That's terrific.
Sure.
And that's a helpful way to practice. And for me, as for you, as for many of the listeners of this podcast, is the rubber hits the road when the bell to end meditation rings. And is that ringing a ring out? No longer going to be present and mindful. Now I'm off to the races, and it doesn't really matter what I did on the cushion. Or is that ringing an invitation? Bring that into the rest of your life and all the lives that you touch throughout that day.
I'd say for me, rather than an invitation, it's a strict directive.
Yeah.
That's using the language from the book, where, in the first book, I was a little looser with my kind of risque language and humor, and, being the protection world, brings with it a level of decorum, and I wanted the book to kind of stay on that level, and be more of a blueprint. There's, I think more of, there's a lot of bodyguard language, and when I was writing it was also at the height, not that it's ended, but at the height of some problems with law enforcement and shootings and things, and I was concerned that, because I used a lot of military language, law enforcement language, in how I outlined what the plan, so to speak, the strategic security plan. And so that was an interesting twist. But you've now brought me around to what you said about guarding the sense doors earlier, because going out there, and when the rubber hits the road and our feet hit the street, we got to walk our talk, so to speak. The next section of the book kind of gets into securing our perimeter in the sense of the sense doors, and what we see, what we hear, what we taste, touch, smell, think. And I liken our conditioning to unexploded bombs that have been planted, and how I get into a little neuroplasticity and the wiring of those bombs, that they're dormant until they're triggered, and we have to secure our perimeter. So they, number one, new ones can't be planted, but the old ones, we need to constantly police that perimeter and the interior of our compound, which our mind. So, those triggers don't activate those harmful bombs of conditioning. Yeah. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's all right. It is just wonderful because it tells me that the book itself, in addition to being appropriate for folks who are from the bodyguard world, from law enforcement, from military, that there's going to be an immediate and visceral understanding of the things you're talking about, but also for those who are not, for whom that is a very foreign way of thinking about the Dhamma of Buddhism. There's nonetheless there's another perspective to this that can really energize the way in which one thinks about, for example, guarding the sense doors. There's another perspective that may help shift that in a very positive way.
It's when I was writing it, I was constantly thinking, and I think I write this several times in the book, am I too over the top with this language? Is it too, there's one section I remember I wrote too cloak and dagger for you, because, and I think that section was, and this ties into what we're talking about, is I talk a lot about the near enemies. Yeah. And, but I equate them to undercover operatives, in a smoke and mirrors, cloak and dagger, espionage operation. And then I talk a lot about that, how we need to identify our allies as opposed to our enemies. And so it for me, it was the most natural thing in the world. It just makes perfect sense from start to finish. But I'm hoping that I was able to put it down in a way that people can say, oh yeah, that's kind of a cool perspective. And it makes a little more, I don't know what the word I'm searching for is, but a little more realistic sense in a way. It kind of gives a modern, maybe a modern description of action that I always felt, for me, was missing in the teachings, in Buddhist teachers I dealt with. I'm really happy about it. I'm really happy about the final product. And I wasn't kidding, because, when I got the copy, the first advanced copy, and I started reading it, I'm like, I like this. And I didn't feel that way about Fighting Buddha. I really didn't. Sometimes I look back on Fighting Buddha and I cringe a little. I'm like, ooh, I'd like to change this. I'd like to change that.
Yeah.
But this one was a much easier write, and I'm satisfied with it. And so far, I've been getting some emails like, I never thought of it that way, or oh yeah, you're a little overboard with this stuff, but I get it, and I liked it. So
great. Well, for folks who are interested, we'll have a link to both books, but the one we're talking about now is Buddha's Bodyguard, How to Protect Your Inner V.I.P. Our guest today and friend, Jeff Eisenberg. Jeff, thanks for being here. Good to see you.
Thank you so much, Ted. I really appreciate it. It's always great to talk with you, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.